Did you know some foods sold as completely normal in America would be banned, reformulated, or heavily restricted in parts of Europe? And no, I'm not talking about some obscure chemical nobody's ever heard of. I'm talking about stuff you probably already have in your kitchen. Coffee Mate, Twinkies, Wheat Thins, products that feel completely ordinary here. But in parts of Europe, some of those same products could not be sold the same way. And once you see why, it gets a lot harder to look at an ordinary grocery shelf the same way again. Because this points to a much bigger issue with how food is regulated in America. And this goes way beyond junk food. You're paying full price for products that often rely on cheaper substitutes, looser labeling rules, and fewer safeguards than most Americans realize. So this isn't just about why Europe restricts certain ingredients. It's about what's in your food, how it's labeled, and why the American system allows so much of it in the first place. Here's the engine behind all of this. Most Americans assume food gets screened the way medicine does. A company makes something new, the government checks it, and only then it goes on the shelf. But that's not really how much of the US food system works. In America, the system is often much closer to this. Sell first, argue later. In other words, an ingredient can end up in your food before it goes through the kind of hard front-end review most people think is happening. And what makes all of this possible is something most people have never even heard of: GRAS. That stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. Originally, that made sense. This idea was created back in 1958 for ingredients like salt, vinegar, and baking soda, things people had been eating for centuries. Nobody thought you needed a giant stack of paperwork just to add a little salt to a biscuit. But then processed food exploded. Companies started creating more additives, more flavorings, more stabilizers, more ways to make food cheaper, sweeter, longer lasting, and easier to mass produce, and the FDA got buried. Too many new ingredients, not enough staff, not enough time. That's where the system quietly changed. And here's the part most people never hear about. In 1997, instead of forcing companies to submit everything for full review, the process became much more voluntary, which meant a company could rely on its own experts or hire outside experts, decide for itself that an ingredient was safe, and move forward without needing the FDA to approve it first. In some cases, the FDA didn't even know that ingredient existed. That's the key point. The question stopped being, did a regulator fully check this before it reached me? And started becoming, has anyone proven this is a problem yet? That is a completely different system. Does that sound backward? Because it is. It's like letting a company write its own speed limit, then waiting to see how many crashes happen before anyone steps in. And this is not some abstract paperwork problem. It's how you end up with ingredients that have been restricted or banned in other countries still showing up in American food for years. Things like brominated vegetable oil in drinks, potassium bromate in bread, or certain artificial food dyes that face much tighter rules in parts of Europe. And when the system is built that way, what do you think companies choose? They choose the version that costs less, lasts longer, and still tastes good enough to keep selling. So instead of the real ingredient, they use a cheaper substitute. Instead of something fresh, they use something ultra stable. Instead of shortening the shelf life, they add whatever keeps it market ready for months. That's why we keep seeing products that look a little too perfect come with labels that read like a chemistry worksheet and feel weirdly far removed from actual food. That's not an accident. That's what a sell now, argue later system produces. Now let's get to the part people misunderstand the most. Europe did not just wake up one day and decide, let's ban American food. What they built instead was a system with two big differences, and those two differences explain almost everything. Let's start with the first one. In a lot of Europe, it's much harder to get a new ingredient into food. Their basic logic is, prove it's safe first. That means the burden is on the manufacturer. If you want to put an additive, preservative, food dye, or any kind of processing chemical into food, you have to show why it should be allowed before it hits the market. Now, don't get me wrong, Europe is not some food paradise. You can still buy junk food there, you can still buy cheap food, heavily processed food, plenty of disappointing food, but the starting point is different. They're more likely to ask hard questions at the front end instead of letting the product spread first and sorting it out later. That's the first part. Part 2 is where the difference becomes really obvious: the label itself. In the US, a label often sells you the idea of the product. In Europe, the label is much closer to a contract. Imagine picking up a product and the name on the front actually guarantees something about what's inside. Not just the vibe, not just the branding, the actual product. That's much closer to how parts of Europe work. Regulators there are not just looking at ingredients, they also care about the name, the origin, and whether the packaging is borrowing credibility it didn't earn. Take Parmesan. In the US, Parmesan can mean all kinds of things: freshly grated cheese, shelf-stable powdered Parmesan, some kind of blend, or something just close enough to borrow the reputation of the real product. But in Europe, Parmigiano Reggiano is a tightly protected name. That name has legal meaning. It has to come from a specific region, made in a specific way. You can't just make something vaguely similar and sell it under that name. Same idea with names like feta or champagne. Those names do not just sound fancy. They're protected by law. And that changes how people shop. Here, you're often buying the image of the thing. Over there, the name is much more likely to be tied to the thing itself. And there's one more piece: traceability. The same product sold in the US may show up in Europe with a shorter ingredient list, different dyes, or a reformulated recipe, not because the company suddenly became more ethical, but because the rules changed. That's the real point. Europe is not perfect, but it is much tighter in two places where America is unusually loose: what can go into food and what gets to call itself food. Once you see that, the gap stops looking random. America gives companies a lot more room to say, this is close enough. Europe gives consumers more power to say, no, it isn't. This is where the story stops being about labels and starts showing up in everyday life. Because when the system rewards cheaper ingredients, longer shelf life, and food that only has to be close enough, that changes what ends up in your cart week after week. And you've probably noticed at least part of that. Sometimes a product looks normal, tastes fine, and still feels a little off in a way that's hard to describe. Maybe it's less satisfying than it should be. Maybe it's the kind of thing you keep eating without ever really feeling done with it. And then a lot of Americans have that same strange experience when they travel or switch up how they eat for a while. Simpler food can feel different. Not because every meal overseas is magical, and not because every American product is terrible, but because a lot of everyday food here is far more processed than most people realize. This isn't guesswork. The numbers are very clear. A huge share of the American diet now comes from ultra-processed foods. That basically means products designed in a factory to maximize flavor, texture, shelf life, and convenience. And to be fair, that does solve real problems. It makes food cheaper to produce, easier to store, easier to ship, easier to sell, but it also creates a very specific kind of eating experience. Food companies know how to dial in salt, sugar, and fat, so a product tastes great, feels craveable, and keeps you coming back for more. Not because they're trying to create the most honest version of a food, but because they're trying to create the most effective version of a product. That distinction matters. Because over time, it doesn't just change what you buy, it changes your baseline. If you grow up with shelf-stable grated Parmesan, that becomes what Parmesan tastes like. If strawberry usually means flavoring, that starts to feel normal. If bread lasting for days and days seems ordinary, fresh bread can start to feel unusual instead of basic. And that may be the biggest consequence of all. A system like this doesn't just fill shelves, it slowly teaches people what food is supposed to be. At the end of the day, this is bigger than one weird ingredient or one misleading label. It's about what kind of food system you're living under, one that asks hard questions before a product hits the shelf, or one that waits until after it's already in your cart. And once you see that difference, a lot of American grocery shopping starts to make a lot more sense. So now I want to hear from you. What's one product you used to think was totally normal and then later realized was way more processed or misleading than you thought? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more videos that break down the stuff hiding in plain sight, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.